Good afternoon, girls and boys. Good afternoon, parents. Good afternoon, carers. My name is Chris Gordon, and I help organise some of the events for Reading's Bookshop. But today, ladies and gentlemen, I had nothing to do with organising this event. For that, we can thank the very wonderful Wheeler Centre. Let's give them a little round of applause. We can also thank the very wonderful publishers. Penguin, should we give them a round of applause? Very quickly, I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping. Sadly, girls and boys, mums and dads, carers, there is to be no flash photography today. There will be an opportunity to ask questions after Jeff has spoken, and of course, and I say this as a very passionate bookseller, there will be an opportunity to have your book signed after the event, and that will be happening just out there in the foyer. Now, Jeff would be very happy to sign 2 of your books from home, but he is happy, God bless his cotton socks, to sign as many books as you like that you have bought today. That's quite good for independent booksellers. And also, while I'm here, I'd like to welcome Teresa and Deb, just Teresa, who are signing for us today. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Jeff Kinney, because I'm thinking that pretty much all of you here have read his books. Stand up if you have not read his books. Okay, of those standing up, you can sit down if you have seen the movie. Okay, after this show is over, you and I will all talk. Okay. Did you know, ladies and gentlemen, that Jeff Kinney in 2009 was listed as one of the 100 most influential people in the world? And he has reached this list because his books, from the moment they were published, have not stayed out of the bestsellers list across the world. That's quite extraordinary. Now, some people think of him as perhaps the Seinfeld for children, but I think actually he's a little bit more clever than that, because he understands children and he knows children, and maybe that's because at home back there in the US, he is a scoutmaster, he is a basketball coach, he is a footy coach, and he has his own children. Now, I think that's enough, because there will be an opportunity for you to ask questions. So if there's something that I've left out, or there's something that Jeff has left out, you could ask him. But when we are asking the questions, I'm going to ask you to listen very carefully, because let's not repeat any questions. And let's not share our stories about the time that you were reading The Diary of a Wimpy Kid on the bus and you got so into the book that you actually missed your bus stop. We don't want to hear those stories just now. What we want to hear is questions that are directed just to Jeff and about why he writes his books. Are we okay with that? Yes, okay, good, okay, good. Now, he's going to come up onto this stage quite soon, and I think one of the ways that we could get his attention is by calling out very loudly indeed, Zooey Mama. So, on the count of 3, my expectation, everybody here, even those that haven't seen the movie or read the book, yell at the top of their voices, Zooey Mama. Are we ready? 1, 2, 3.
Hello. Thank you very much. Great job. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here today. Last night, I actually got to go to my first ever footy game she said I'm a footy coach back at home. It's not true. I'm a soccer coach back at home. So last night was my first ever footy game, and we went to the Essendon-Richmond game. And I went for Richmond, which I guess was a mistake last night, but I tried. But it's a long way from Plainville, Massachusetts, where I come from. So this has been just a trip of a lifetime for me. And thank you so much for coming out to hear me talk. I hope I entertain you in the next half hour or so as I tell you the story of my books and how they came to be. I actually didn't set out to become a children's author at all. This all happened by accident, actually, believe it or not. I always wanted to be a newspaper cartoonist. And in fact, in college, I had a comic called Doof, and I wanted to show you one of those. Let's see if Doof comes up there. Hopefully it will, yeah. There is my comic strip, Doof, back in college. I was about 18 years old, and I created this character who has a big nose and a big ear and big lips, and he looks kind of awkward. And I drew him for a year at a school called Villanova, and then I moved to a different school, Maryland, and I carried my comic strip with me. So there is Doof. He's changed a lot, and that tends to happen with cartoon characters. But one thing changed. One thing actually stayed the same, which was that he had those 3 little hairs on the back of his head. And I'll never know exactly why I drew him to look like that. I think I wanted to make him look really different from the other characters. But it turns out that there's this really long history of male cartoon character boys, actually, who are bald or nearly bald. In fact, the very first cartoon character was called the Yellow Kid, and he was bald. And of course, there was Charlie Brown, who's probably one of the most famous bald characters. So Doof, I was just carrying on in that tradition, I guess. But Doof, when he drew himself as looking almost perfect. So you're going to see here that Doof on the left-hand side of the screen, he draws himself looking a lot like Greg Heffley. So Greg Heffley, in this form, has really been around for, I guess, about 23 years, if I'm doing my math correctly. So when I was drawing my cartoons in college, I thought, you know what, I like what I'm doing, but I'd like to get a lot better. So I wrote to different cartoonists who had comics in the newspapers, and I said, what can I do to get better? And I actually developed a friendship and a relationship with the guy who does Big Nate. His name is Lincoln Peirce, and here's one of his letters to me. Uh-oh, loading. Here's one of his letters to me, where he was showing me how to get better spacing on my word bubbles. You kids probably don't really write letters to each other, handwritten letters, but we had a correspondence going that went on for about 3 years. And one day my younger brother called me up and he said, you've got to look at today's newspaper. Look at the comic section of the newspaper and look at Big Nate. And I did, and here's what I saw. And I looked very closely at the comics, and I said, what am I supposed to be looking for? And then I looked at the piece of paper that Nate was holding in the strip. And it had these 3 little stickers on a piece of paper. And one of the stickers was Doof. And so the cartoonist had taken the care to put my comic character into his comic. And better yet, he was on this sticker sheet with Bart Simpson and Garfield. So that was a huge moment in my life. I went from being, in my mind, a nobody to a somebody, because now I had my work published in a real newspaper. So that was probably honestly one of the best moments of my life. And it was just this little tiny centimeter on a page, but it validated me and made me feel great. So that kind of helped me keep going. And so for a few years, I had my comic in the newspaper. And in fact, I started getting attention for it. And here's a picture in the Washington Post, which is sort of like the Sydney Herald here. And they ran this big feature on me. It was a full page, and it was all about how I was going to become this great cartoonist. And there's a picture of me at age 21, and I look very confident and cocky. You can see I've kind of got my thumb up there, right? And I thought that I was just going to have an easy time of becoming a cartoonist. But the truth is, I didn't have anything else published for another 14 years. So it was a long period in between. And I'm going to show you what happened in between. I got lots of these, right? And this is a rejection letter. for any artists or performers or writers, cartoonists out there, you might expect to get a lot of these before you break through. And you can't let it get you down. It's kind of hard to get these letters that don't give you any information or feedback. But, I suffered through, I guess, about 3 years of rejection letters before realizing what my problem was. And the problem wasn't with them, it was with me. The problem was that I just couldn't draw in a professional style. I just couldn't do it. I practiced and tried to get better, but I just couldn't do it. So I said, well, what am I going to do? I'm kind of stuck here. I draw like a kid, and but I want my cartoons published. So that's when a little light bulb went off over my head, and I realized that if I acted like I was drawing like a kid on purpose and created this character who was a kid, then maybe I could get away with it. And so that's where the idea for Greg Heffley came from, was my failure to break into real cartooning. So I got this idea, Diary of a Wimpy Kid, Greg Heffley, and I wanted to just roll. I wanted to just start writing. But instead, I got this blank sketchbook, and it was 77 pages long. And I said, I'm going to fill up this sketchbook with all sorts of ideas, and then I'm going to take the very best of those ideas and start writing my book. So here's the very first page of my sketchbook. And you can see that this is where some of the characters were born. In the upper left-hand corner, you see Rowley. He looks very different than he does now. And Greg is somewhere in the middle. I had this idea on the right-hand side that Greg is terrified of a little old man who sleeps under his bed. In the lower left-hand corner, there's this character named Nasty Pants who only made his debut a few months ago, and more on him later. But I did about 3 of these on the first night, 3 of them on the next night, and things were going pretty smoothly. And I said, I'll be done with this idea book, in a few weeks, actually. And so what happened was I started drawing smaller and smaller. I didn't really realize it at the time, but I started to really draw smaller. And I think what was happening was that I was really afraid that I was racing to the end of my idea book too quickly, and that I wasn't going to have enough ideas for a good book. So these pages took me, really kind of a few days or a few weeks to fill out. And my very last idea page looked like this, all right, which is completely insane. But that one idea page took about 4 months to write. And by the time, and that one page represents about 500 pages of written material. So I had plenty of material by the time I was done with my idea book. The kinds of ideas I was putting into my idea book were ideas from things that had happened to me as a kid, or things that had happened to my brothers and sisters when we were kids. And here's one of my favorite stories. My younger brother, when he was on the swim team, he was told by the umpire, he said, okay, it's your first year in swim team. What you do is when I shoot off the starting pistol, you have to swim to the other end of the pool as fast as you can. Well, my brother didn't know that the starting pistol fired blanks, right? He thought it fired real bullets. So he made sure that when that bullet landed, he was going to be nowhere to be found. So I wasn't quite the athlete that my brother was. I used to hide out from my swim coach during swim meets and swim practices. I'd ask in the first few minutes if I could use the bathroom, and then I'd go and hide in there. So this is me as a kid, really, right? And we used to wear Speedos. I don't know if they still wear them around here, but it was pretty horrible, these tiny little bikini briefs. And it would get really cold in there. So like any normal kid would do, I did this, right? I kept myself warm, and that's why I survived, to see you here. But some of the ideas from Diary of a Wimpy Kid actually came from my subconscious, things that I didn't really realize that were in my brain. A few months ago, I was in my garage in Plainville, and I found this old picture from my high school days, and here it is. And this is actually a picture of my high school girlfriend's mother, who would kill me if she knew I was showing this picture. But she accidentally took a picture of herself. She reached out for a camera that was on a shelf, and it flashed, and it startled her. And I just think that picture is like one of the funniest things I've ever seen. And so years later, Roderick has a party in my Wimpy Kid books, right? And Roderick has a party, and the teenagers accidentally take a picture of themselves having the party in the home. So you can see how similar, the composition of that picture is to the photo. So I worked on my ideas and all of this for 4 years. It took me 4 years to fill up that sketch journal, and then it took me another 4 to write the first draft of my book. And when I was ready with it, after 8 years, I hadn't shown anything to anyone for all that time, but I printed out this sample packet of about, excuse me, maybe 20 pages, and I brought it to a comics convention. And I walked it around, and I showed it to this guy who was an editor, and he said, "This is exactly what we're looking for." So after all that time, I finally had this kind of breakout success, and somebody liked my work. So it was very, very exciting. So I'm going to show you the very first cover of what I had in mind for Wimpy Kid. You can see that it looks kind of boring, actually, compared to the titles or the covers now. But that's because I thought that in all of those years, in those 8 years, that I was actually writing a book for grown-ups. I wrote one book that was 1,300 pages long, and I thought it was going to be a look back on what it was like to be a kid, to remind adults what it was like to be a kid. And my publisher said, "No, actually, you've written a children's series." And so this is all how I became a children's author on accident. I never thought for a second in all that time that I was writing a book that kids would enjoy. And I don't know why I didn't think of it, but I'm glad that I didn't, because I think I would have written it in a different way if I knew that. But for so here's the cover of the first Wimpy Kid book. And when it came out, I was very excited. I went out on tour, and I was like, this is going to be great. People are going to come out to see me. And the truth is, for the first year, basically almost nobody came to see me. I went to book signing after book signing, and nobody showed up at all. And I had a presentation just like this. I was ready to tell people about how I created Diary of a Wimpy Kid, but nobody showed up at all. And then one day, this little girl showed up. I went all the way to California, which is like going from here to Perth, I guess. And this one little girl showed up, and so I just sat next to her on a bench and gave her my whole speech. And and she just kept looking at her mother like, "Get me out of here." So I'm going to take a little sip of water here because I can feel my throat go dry. Hopefully you won't hear like gurgling here. So anything? Hopefully not. So along the way, I started to hear from teachers and parents who said, this is the first book that my reluctant reader has ever read. And I had never heard of the term reluctant reader before. And so I kept getting it in email after email. And I was like, what is a reluctant reader? I guess I should have been able to figure it out. But I've come to realize that reluctant reader is just a long way of saying a short word, which is boys, right? And there are some girls too, but in the States especially, there are tons of boys who just will not read. And so now I'm having a lot of fun writing for reluctant readers. And now my books have been published in about 40 different languages. It's really crazy. I wanted to show you some of the covers there. Here's the Korean version, the Greek version, the Hebrew version, which is printed from right to left, so that's kind of interesting. This is the Japanese version, which I think is really unique in lots of different ways. It's got a really different design style. And then the characters actually have 5 fingers. And in cartooning, it's very typical to have 4 fingers on your cartoon characters because it's sort of enough. But here, in the Japanese culture, they actually can't show or depict people with 4 fingers. Because hundreds of years ago, there was a class of people who was discriminated against, and they were called the 4-finger people. And so to this day, you cannot draw characters with 4 fingers. So they added a 5th finger to each hand. Very interesting. One second. I wanted to show you the German cover here. This is, I'm not going to pronounce it right, but it's sort of like Greg's Tagebuch von Idioten am Singeld, right? And it means Greg's journal, I'm surrounded by idiots, which is a much better title than the one I came up with. But I said, well, why can't we just call it Diary of a Wimpy Kid in Germany? And they said, well, because we don't have a word for wimp in our country. And then this one I like, it's the Brazilian version. Diário de banana. And again, I'm learning about other cultures here, so I said, well, what does banana mean in your country? And they said, it means banana. But like I said, it's been 5 years since my first book came out, and I've had this really crazy life since then. You know, I've gotten to do so many things. I think I've gotten to meet 3 different U.S. presidents. I went to the White House a few weeks ago and got to read and got to meet the Obamas. And then, you know, a real highlight of my life was a few days ago I got to speak at the Sydney Opera House. So it's just been this crazy life. And on the other hand, my life at home is really, really normal. Like I said, I live in a town called Plainville, and that's not a made-up name, and it really is Plain. And I'm actually the cub master there. And for the first few months that I was a leader, actually, no kids came up to me. Nobody said, you know, hey, I read your books or anything like that. And I was like, you know, darn, like why doesn't anybody recognize that I'm writing these books that these kids are reading? And I remember this one kid came up to me one day and he goes, what's your name? And I said, it's Mr. Kinney. And he goes, what's your first name? And I said, it's Jeff. And I was like waiting for it. And he thought about it and he goes, you have the same name as the guy who wrote those books. And then a few weeks later, we were doing a food drive in Plainville, and everybody put their canned food out on their front porch. That's what everybody was supposed to do. And then we all collected the canned food and brought it back to the base. Well, this Boy Scout walks up to me at the base. He saw me, spied me, and just stopped in his tracks. And he looks at me, he points right at me, he goes, you're Jeff Kinney. And I'm like, yes, that's right, I am. And I was like, finally, you know. And I'm patting myself down for a pen to sign something for him. And he goes, well, you didn't leave your canned food out on your front porch. So, like I said, my life in Plainville keeps me really humble. They don't know I'm going to Australia and things like that, and maybe that's a good thing. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about Cabin Fever, my last book, because there are some real-life stories that inspired the stories in this book. One of them is that I was actually bullied as a kid. This one kid picked on me just about every day. And don't feel too sorry for me because I was in about the 6th grade and this kid was in kindergarten. So that's where Nasty Pants came from. Let's see what else we've got here. We've got baby Alfredo. My son, we were getting ready, my wife and I were getting ready to have a second son, and we wanted to prepare Will, my older son, for having a baby brother. So we got him a doll, which he promptly named Alfredo, and then he took it by the hand and threw it against the wall, which is why we don't leave him alone with my younger son. But in the book, Greg gets a doll. He loses it promptly. And then he dresses up a grapefruit to look like the baby, you know, draws a face on it because he feels so guilty that he's lost this doll. And he's terrified that it's going to come back to find him one day. And here's a story that was inspired by something that happened to me in real life. Let's see if this works. So Greg and his friend hang up some posters, and you have to use your imagination here that they're neon green, you know, really, really, really bright green. And what happens is it rains, and the posters leave stain marks on the building. Well, this very thing happened to me in college. I went around our university, and I actually hung up all of these flyers for Doof. And then in the morning, I woke up and I looked around campus and the flyers were still there, or so I thought. There were green splotches on every single white column of the school. And you can see here, that's a fake mock-up, but you get the idea. So I ruined, I vandalized the whole entire school right before I graduated. But I've had a lot of fun. I've also gotten to be involved in the movies, the Diary of a Wimpy Kid movies. So here's a picture. Oh, actually, here are some pictures of illustrations I did that became moments in the movies. So here's an illustration from one of the books. There's the film equivalent. Here's another, and the film equivalent. There's Greg and Raleigh making fun of the teenagers who can't get them on Halloween, and then on film. And then, of course, let's see this last picture here. Greg and Raleigh there. So it's been really neat seeing the characters come to life on screen. And I'm actually good friends with the actors. Here's myself and Zach Gordon on the set of the second movie. And here's Robert. I really like this picture because there's like 3 lies in the picture. One is that he's dressed in winter clothes, right? And it's actually the middle of the summer in Vancouver where we filmed. Another is that big blue spot in the background, that's a blue screen, and we filled in a snowy neighborhood afterwards in post-production. And then the other is that snow on the ground is actually just really finely chopped up paper. So it's been really fun seeing how they make movies, and I've gotten to be a part of that. I actually got to be in the second movie. This is me as Mr. Hills, Holly Hills' dad. And if you look really carefully in the church scene when Greg has chocolate in his pants, there's a guy in the second pew who stands up and is outraged, and that is me. So it was fun to be in the movie, of this story that I created. A little bit of movie magic here. This is kind of cool. This very strange picture. These are actually inflatable people. And what happens is if there's a big crowd scene like this in a movie, they'll fill the first several rows with actual human beings, but then they'll fill the rest of the place with inflatable people. That's because inflatable people don't, need to go to the bathroom, they don't need to be fed, and they don't need to get paid, and they don't make much noise. So you can see, here's a picture of Zach Gordon sitting amongst all these inflatable people. And there is nothing stranger than walking into an auditorium where there's, that's filled with, or mostly filled with, inflatable silent people. Very strange. Yeah, that woman or whatever to the right of Zach is just, there's something wrong going on there. But it's funny, these kids, they come on and they act in these films, but then they go back to their normal lives. So it's really, this is a moment when Robert Capron had just finished his last scene in the second movie. This is Raleigh. And it's really emotional for the kids because they're part of this family, and then all of a sudden they're kind of sent home. But we did get to make a third film, which we're calling Dog Days, which I'm sure you kids are confused by because that's the 4th book, but it's the third movie. So we mix the stories of The Last Straw and Dog Days into this movie. But I want to end by the speech part by telling you about something else that's been really cool to work on. I actually got to make a giant helium balloon out of Greg. There's something in the States called the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade, which is this big parade in New York City where there's all these cartoons of classic cartoon characters. There's these huge helium balloons. And I actually got to design one this past 2 years ago, actually, and make my character be a part of that family. And what was really neat was I went to the University of Maryland, where Jim Henson also went, and he created Kermit the Frog and the Muppets. So my balloon got to fly behind Kermit the Frog, which was really cool. But it started with a sketch. It started with a tiny sketch. This is probably only about 2 inches tall, this little sketch, and Greg is meant to be clutching his diary here because he's scared to be in the air. And that got turned into a clay model. And this is myself and my editor actually working on the clay model. And we wanted to get it just right because any mistake was going to be blown up huge. And the Greg Heffley balloon was about actually almost as long as this room is wide. So we didn't want to get anything wrong. So finally we got to see a test flight of the balloon. And you can see cartoonists are always hiding little messages in their strips and in their work. And here the message I was hiding was that the colors are black, white, yellow, and red. And those are the colors of the state flag of Maryland, where I went to school. So here's a picture of you can see along the ground there's these balloon handlers, right? It took about maybe somewhere between 70 and 100 people to make sure one balloon didn't get out of control. Let's see. So finally Greg got to fly, and this past November I got to walk the balloon for the first time. And this is a picture of myself and my brothers holding the balloon up. So that's pretty neat. And then ultimately Greg got to fly down the streets of New York City, and there's the Empire State and the Empire State Building in the background. And the reason I wanted to end with this slide or this idea is because kids are so creative, and I'm not especially talented. Like I said, I draw like a kid, and I don't write particularly well. And I'm working out of this small town in Plainville. But it's really neat. In today's day and age, you can broadcast your creative ideas all over the world. And I just want to say, if there are any kids out there or grown-ups that have an idea that you believe in, just keep working on it, because maybe one day you'll get to see it fly as well. So I'd love to take your questions. We're going to roll right into the Q&A portion of this ceremony. Yes?
There's going to be some people with microphones walking around.
Okay.
But perhaps what we could do is, so that we can see you clearly, is maybe you could stand up if you have a question. You can stand right where you are. You, gentlemen, you are number 1 over here in the blue. Yes? You have a question? And someone is going to come with a microphone to you. You don't need to move at all. And Jeff will answer your question, and it will be marvellous.
Sounds good.
Sounds all right, doesn't it? And then I'm going to come to you.
Draw his pictures.
How do I draw my pictures? Is that the question?
I think that is the question.
I actually, I used to draw my pictures on pencil and paper, but I don't do that anymore. I actually have a tablet. It's sort of like an iPad that you can draw on. So I do everything digitally now. And what happened was technology sort of caught up. So a cartoonist can use that as a tool, and it still looks like it's hand-drawn, which it is.
It's over there. You, sir, in the jacket.
Did you ever get in trouble for doodling in class?
That's a good question.
Did I ever get in trouble for doodling in class? I think I definitely did. And I actually am a person with ADD, which is attention deficit disorder. And I'm sure there are people, grown-ups, kids here that also have ADD. It's very hard for me to pay attention in class, especially. And in the States, they've just done this study that said that kids who doodle in class who have ADD actually can pay attention better than if they weren't doodling. And I really believe in that. That's the only way that I can listen to what's going on, is to keep doodling.
This gentleman right here.
Are there any plans for Diary of Wimpy Kid 7 to be coming out this year?
Yes, I have a new book coming out in November. I've got it in my pocket. With the change of technology, I write everything on my phone now. So I have all my ideas in my pocket. And the book is going to be about, I'm not allowed to say what the title or the cover is just yet. It's coming out in a few days. But it's going to be about Greg and Valentine's Day, and Greg trying to get a date to a dance. We've got a guy here who's pretty eager.
He's pretty cute. Mr. Chicago Bulls 23.
Have your kids read your books, and what did they think of them?
That's a great question. My 6-year-old is a little too young. Hasn't quite read my books yet. And he's very contrarian, so I don't know if he will actually read my books. But my older son, he read them, but then he moved on very quickly. He actually moved on to Harry Potter and the Percy Jackson series, and I couldn't be more happy, because I think in a way he didn't need my books. He's become a reader, and I think a lot of kids that my books are the first ones that they read, and then they move on and hopefully become lifelong readers. There's lots of great worlds you can explore through books.
Over here.
Is there anybody else that you look up to for your books?
Oh, that's a good question. I think that I really look up to everybody in a way. Harry Potter, I think that J.K. Rowling is just about the best storyteller of our generation, so I'll mention her. But I think that there's this cartoonist from a long time ago named Carl Barks who did the Donald Duck and Uncle Scrooge comics in the 1940s and 50s and maybe 60s. And I still think that's the best storytelling I've ever read of any sort. So those are the people that I look up to the most.
I think there's a little girl right at the very back there. She's had her... Yep.
Out of all of your books, which is your favorite?
That's a good question. I think I like them all in different ways. I always like them much more when they're done with, because I have a full-time job actually, and so I'm working on my books on the side, and so it's really hard for me to work on my books. And I think I like The Ugly Truth the best, because one thing I couldn't decide about Greg was when is he going to grow up? And The Ugly Truth is all about growing up. Actually, it's about adolescence and puberty, about kids getting like pimples and facial hair and all this kind of stuff. And Greg can't, for some reason, it's not happening to him, right? And what I realized is that Greg isn't a literary character, he's a cartoon character. And since he's a cartoon character, he can't grow up. So the reason Greg can't grow up is because he's a cartoon character and he just doesn't know it.
We've got time for one more question. It's going to be that last in the stripe. Yep.
Oh. Does Rowley represent someone, one of your friends in your childhood?
There's parts of my best friend Ryan in Rowley, just parts though. But I created Rowley as a counterpoint to Greg, because Greg is kind of an average kid. He's a lot like I was. And when I was a kid, I was in a rush to grow up. And I think that most kids feel that way. They see the freedom that you can get by being a little bit older, right? And what I like about Rowley is that he's a kid and he likes being a kid. And you know, being a kid is a really good thing. It's something to really enjoy and to remember and to savor. And I wasn't really like that as a kid, so I created Rowley as sort of the ultimate pure kid. So what I wanted to say before we get to the book signing is, first, again, thank you so much for coming out to see me. It means the world to me. I love your city. I love your country. I hope to be back, and I can't wait to meet you and sign your books. So thank you very much.